Hello all my crafty people, Rachel here from the Lone Star Crafter. Today I'm coming at you with another beginner sewing tutorial, and today we're actually going to be doing a beginner quilt block. This is called the Granny Square. And as you can see, I finally put together my outstanding project. If you watch my Whip It Good 2021, you'll know that this is a quilt. These are blocks that I had started several years ago, and I finally put them together and made a really great little throw quilt. So I thought I would show you how to put these blocks together because I love this block because it's very versatile. As you can see, I did a lot of florals, a lot more traditional style fabrics, but you could also do, more contemporary colors. You could do seasonal colors like autumn, Christmas, and I think this would also be a really great baby quilt because you could do black and white and then red in the center. Now, you may be looking at this block and think, wow, this looks really complicated. There's lots of angles. Like, how do I sew this together? Actually, it's very, very simple. I love this block because it looks hard, but it's actually really easy because we're going to be sewing it by rows. So if you're new to quilting, don't be intimidated by the granny square because I'm going to show you how to put it together really easily and make a really beautiful, simple quilt that all your friends will think you spent hours and hours on. So let's Alrighty, so for the granny square block, you're going to need 25 2.5-inch squares. Now for me, what I did was I picked one color for the center square, another color for the four that directly touch it, four for the squares outside of that, or a different color for the four that go along that white edge you see, and then a totally different color, a nice solid color for all 12 pieces that go on the outside. Now you don't have to do this many colors if you don't want to, but if you do have a lot of different scraps, it does use up scraps really well. And for me, it's visually easier to see where the pieces go when you have different colors for all those different little sections. And you can do, you could do actually a more simplified inner part of the square, solids in the middle and then prints on the outsides. I had a ton of those floral fabrics and things like that. So right now what I'm doing is sewing the rows together. So you'll notice that it goes 1, 3, 5, 7, and then back down to 5, 3, 1. So that's how we're going to sew the rows together. So I'm just sewing each one individually first. If you're a beginner, I would highly recommend this because especially if you're doing a lot of different colors like I'm doing, or actually if you're doing very few colors, you want to do this because it gets a little confusing what goes where. I've sewn a ton of these blocks at this point in time, so I'm pretty used to how the pattern goes. But when you're new, this part can get a little confusing, if you're, I don't know, for me it does. So, what I do is I do one block at a time. So I lay it all out. When I first started putting all these blocks together, like, I don't know, 3 years ago, I would take a picture of each one. So that way I knew where the colors went, what did I have where. And so that was a really great visual reminder for myself. So maybe if you get kind of discombobulated a little bit easier, I would say lay out one block at a time, take a picture of it, and then just sew each row individually, and then you'll sew the sewn rows together. And so I'm just going through. I'm working on my Janome Skyline S9. It has what they call it an AccuFeed foot, but it's a walking foot. And the Janome actually has a 1/4-inch sole that you can put on their walking foot. So that's what I'm doing right now, putting all the pieces together. And so this is definitely the time, when you're first getting started and quilting, you want to sort of take your time with this step, sewing all the squares together, making sure that you get that perfect 1/4-inch seam. And you definitely, when you cut your squares, you want to make sure they're as consistent as possible. They don't have to necessarily be very, very accurate, each one, but as long as they're all consistently cut the same, as long as they're relatively consistently the same size, and that you keep your 1/4-inch consistent, then the rows are going to come together really well because we have a lot of nesting seams here. It can get really wonky really fast. And for, for a beginner block, that may seem intimidating, but this is the easiest way to put, this is the easiest and the most difficult way to put straight seams together is a block like this. So I think it's actually a really good practice if you're a beginner. If you're worried that, your rows aren't going to line up perfectly, if that's something that's really important to you, if you're a perfectionist, definitely do more similar colors in your squares. You can go a little bit more monotone. You could do a light gray and a dark gray or something like that, and that will help blend in any sort of missed or unaligned squares. I don't really care about that kind of thing personally. I just like to go for it. You could also do this with like black, white, and red fabrics if you're doing a baby quilt. And of course, the baby's not going to care if your seams don't match or anything like that. So what I'm going to do is sew all the rows together first, and then I'm going to iron them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to what's called ironing the seams open. As you can see, you have an option to like iron that little extra piece of fabric either to the dark side fabric or the light sided fabric. On a block like this, because there are so many different seams, I like to iron my seams open. So you can see I've laid that piece of fabric completely flat. And then what I do when I'm done is I starch it with some best press. Now I've already starched this fabric before I ever even cut into it. So one, that's going to create a nice, give it a nice slight rigidity to the fabric. So you can see that when I'm first ironing the rows, I kind of, I lay it down one end on the ironing board and then I roll my iron across it. And I'm not yanking on it, but I am giving it a little bit of pressure because the fact of the matter is your fabric's going to distort at some point or another. It's fabric. It's not, we're not working with steel here. Like, we're picking these rows up and down, we're sewing with them, we're manipulating them. The fabric gets distorted. So I'd rather be the one distorting it purposefully, understanding which way it's moving and things like that. And then that way it's really consistent throughout all of my blocks, if that makes sense. For me, I know a lot of people are all about accuracy when it comes to quilting, but Jenny Doan from the Missouri Star Quilt Company always talks about consistency. That's really what's going to make or break the overall look of a quilt block and then eventually the quilt top itself. Here I am, what I'm doing is pinning the rows together. Now, again, when we're talking about consistency, what I do is I make sure to line up the center squares. So we are working with odd numbers. So right now I have the 3 square row pinned to the 5 square row, and the center square, I'm going to work from the center square out, right? That's going to be the biggest thing, especially in the actual center block here. This is the 5 squares coming down to the center 7 square row. And what I do is I take my pin and I actually insert it into the seam itself, as you can see there, from the front end, and then I go through the back and then I come through the front again. And again, I start with the center. That's going to be the most important part, and I do that for all the rows that I can. And then I kind of feel it out too. As I'm sewing, you want to make sure that you're kind of feeling for it, making sure that everything's lining up for yourself. And I've tried it without pinning. I really don't enjoy pinning very much, but there are certain things where you need to pin it. And then also don't be afraid to move your seam over too. So we've sewn our seams open, but sometimes I find that if I just flip the seam to the right or the left on top of the other one, they'll actually sit together a little bit better and line up a little bit more consistently as well. For the single square that we put on top of the three squares, I just line it up with the seam allowances. So I just make sure the edges of the single square kind of float over the seam itself. And then I know that I'm pretty good. Now, remember, the center area of this block is more important than the outer. Like all those blue squares on this block are going to get chopped off for the most part. They're going to get cut almost in half actually pretty much in half. So don't worry too much about the outer edges or the ends of the rows or anything like that. The center is really where we're really focused in on. And for me, I always, for all the blocks that I sewed, for the quilt that I did, I sewed each block individually. It's just so much easier to keep track of. And for me, I like the process. Now you can definitely lay out a ton of different blocks at a time and have them ready to go for you. But again, I'm a procrastinator, so. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna cut the outer edge of the fabric off. This is gonna be something you wanna eyeball. I think mine finished at 8.5 inches. But we want to make sure you don't line it up with 8.5 and then make that first cut at 8.5 right away, because we have to cut all the way around the center. And if you make that first cut right at 8.5 inches, you may cut into your little corners of your center little granny square, your little center X. So what I did, I just circled it around. I kept cutting, cutting, cutting. Now you can go a little bit bigger if you want to. You can go a little bit smaller. And I did press the squares before I cut them. That's a big thing. You want to make sure you press them. You could press the seams on the rows open if you want to. That's up to you. But yeah, so I think mine finished at 8.5, and I just kind of went around, straightening up the edges and things like that. And there you go. You have your granny square block.